A tired man had just finished work and was heading home when, out of nowhere, a car slammed into him from behind. Frustrated, he got out to confront the driver, only to find out the other car was a luxury Rolls-Royce. Inside was a young woman who looked like she came from serious money. Seeing this, the man instantly dropped his anger. He didn't even dare to ask her for an explanation. But then he noticed something shocking: the woman was bleeding. She had clearly just had a miscarriage. That man, Gong Ryong, was actually an obstetrician. Without wasting a second, he picked her up and rushed her to the hospital. He quickly made arrangements for an emergency operation. But right before surgery began, the woman removed her sunglasses, and Gong Ryong suddenly realized who she was: the daughter of South Korea's most powerful billionaire. Her name was Goyen, and she had just gone through a bad breakup. She'd basically given up on love, convinced that all men were trash. But Gong Ryong didn't treat her like royalty. He stayed calm and gentle, speaking to her with kindness, not flattery. He told her to trust him and that everything would be okay. Goyen was soon put under anesthesia, and the surgery to remove the fetus began. But a few days later, chaos broke loose. A bunch of men in black suits stormed into Gong Ryong's office and forced him into a car. Inside the car was none other than Goyen's father, the chairman of the country's most powerful business empire. The second he saw Gong Ryong, the chairman exploded in anger. He accused him of ending his bloodline and demanded he take full responsibility. That night, under the chairman's orders, his men dragged Gong Ryong to the seaside to throw him into the ocean. Even on the verge of death, Gong Ryong stood firm in his beliefs as a doctor. He told them that if it meant saving the mother, he'd make the same decision again. In the end, the chairman didn't kill him, but he did ruin him. Gong Ryong was fired, and after that, no hospital would hire him. Broke and desperate, Gong Ryong made endless calls, looking for any kind of job, even the worst ones. But nobody would hire him. Then one day, Goyen showed up. She told him she wanted to make it up to him. She had secretly watched the whole scene where her father yelled at him, and realized that Gong Ryong might actually be one of the rare good guys left. But Gong Ryong didn't feel grateful, he felt bitter. After all, it was because of her that he lost his entire career. Even small jobs wouldn't take him now. Then suddenly Goyen kissed him. A full, passionate kiss. After the kiss, she confessed she liked him. Gong Ryong was stunned. In total disbelief, he rejected her on the spot. But not long after that, something unexpected happened. One night, while Gong Ryong was drunk at a tiny local bar, Goyen appeared again. This time, she didn't hold back. Gong Ryong, overwhelmed by alcohol and emotion, ended up falling into her arms, and the two spent a fiery night together. The next morning, Goyen was even more direct. She told him she loved him and wanted to marry him. Gong Ryong didn't think he deserved someone like her. But for some reason this time he didn't say no. Just like that, the once broke doctor suddenly became the future son-in-law of South Korea's wealthiest family. Soon after, the company spent a jaw-dropping 700 billion won to send Gong Ryong into space for an 8-day mission. His job? To research sperm genetics aboard a space laboratory. That night, the rocket prepared for launch. As the countdown ended, it soared into the sky. But just seconds after liftoff, disaster struck. Lightning hit the rocket. Gong Ryong, who had never even imagined going to space, was totally freaked out. But luckily, the spaceship was well designed and survived the storm. Once in Earth's orbit, Gong Ryong saw the planet from above for the first time. It was beautiful, but he was also seriously space-sick. He even started hallucinating. At one point, he thought he saw a dead astronaut floating outside the ship. Gong Ryong couldn't stop throwing up, and things only got worse from there. Gong Ryong's airway was blocked, and he soon passed out. Commander Eve quickly jumped into action. In space, things work differently. She had just 7 minutes to save him before it was too late. Eve immediately contacted the medical team on Earth and followed their step-by-step instructions. Inside the zero-gravity spacecraft, things were tricky, but she managed. Bracing her foot on a support panel, Eve used all her strength to perform abdominal thrusts on Gong Ryong. After a tense struggle, the object blocking his throat finally came out. When Gong Ryong opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Eve, the strong, stunning commander who had just saved his life. She had even hurt her toe during the rescue. Eve wasn't just a skilled commander, she also had a past. Back at Earth's command center, she had once been in a relationship with a fellow colleague. Once Gong Ryong's vital signs were back to normal, he contacted Earth again. That's when he realized what he saw earlier wasn't a hallucination after all. It wasn't a corpse, it was a satellite made from an old astronaut suit. Later, when Gong Ryong was resting alone, Eve came in and gently tucked a thermometer inside his suit. He immediately felt overheated and flustered. During their break, they turned off all communication with Earth. Gong Ryong, noticing Eve's injured toe, kindly reminded her that it was still bleeding. As he tried to treat the wound, he realized it was worse than expected. A simple band-aid wouldn't be enough. Surgery was needed to stop the bleeding. Gong Ryong opened the medical kit with confidence, pulling out a needle and thread. But in zero gravity, even holding things steady was hard. He struggled just trying to thread the needle. No matter how many times he tried, it just wouldn't work. Eve finally had enough. She took the tools from him and, drawing on her own experience, threaded the needle in one smooth move. Then she handed everything back and told him to stitch the wound. But there was a problem. The syringe for the anesthetic was missing. Gong Ryong panicked, looking everywhere for it. But Eve calmly told him to go ahead with the stitching anyway. A little pain was no big deal to her. When Gong Ryong hesitated again, Eve even offered to do the stitching herself. That gave him the courage to push through. He completed the procedure and bandaged her toe. Right after finishing, Gong Ryong noticed the missing syringe floating nearby. Startled, he gently blew it away while sneaking a glance at Eve. She just patted him on the shoulder and went downstairs. As she left, Gong Ryong muttered to himself, admiring her and her oddly beautiful toes. Back on Earth, his girlfriend Goyen was deeply worried. She knew this space mission wasn't just a scientific project. It was a secret challenge set by her father, the chairman. If Gong Ryong failed, the chairman would force them to break up. Goyen was overwhelmed with anxiety, constantly thinking about their time together. She remembered the day she confessed her love, but Gong Ryong didn't say it back. All he said was that he would never betray her. While lost in thought, her ex-boyfriend suddenly called. He was also a space scientist, and somewhere out there in the universe still had feelings for her. Over the phone, he warned her that if Gong Ryong didn't treat her right, he'd come back for her. Meanwhile, according to the plan, Gong Ryong's spacecraft had now entered Earth's orbit and was ready to dock with the International Space Station. After carefully completing all the steps, the docking was a success. Before opening the hatch, Gong Ryong took out a small package. It was a gift he'd brought for the scientists on board. But before they could continue, something unexpected happened. Eve got distracted by flies. Inside the cabin, a pair of male and female flies were sitting on a banana and had started mating. Eve lit up with excitement. She pulled out a magnifying glass and watched them closely, fascinated by the process of life forming in space. Gong Ryong was drawn in too, quietly watching beside her. Eve explained that in space, fly mating could last up to 20 minutes, sometimes even longer than human mating. Seeing how excited she was, Gong Ryong couldn't help but smile. His gaze softened as he looked at her. Once the flies finished mating, Eve carefully placed them into a test tube. Eve reminded Gong Ryong that the most important mission in space was to create and protect life. But Gong Ryong, being playful, joked that he wanted to name the male fly Gong Ryong and the female one Eve. Eve immediately shut that down. "Call me Commander," she said firmly. Once the flies were safely secured, Eve opened the hatch. Gong Ryong floated out clumsily. He still wasn't used to zero gravity. On board the International Space Station, he met several scientists. One of them, surprisingly, was Kong Soo, Gon's ex-boyfriend. After introductions, Gong Ryong handed out the gift he brought, a variety pack of flavored ice creams. But this ice cream had a secret. It was connected to his real mission. See, the chairman's son, Gon's brother, was infertile, something that had always weighed heavily on the chairman. His daughter-in-law Min Jiang once gave him a scientific report saying that in zero gravity, damaged sperm could possibly repair themselves. Using this research, she suggested a plan. Send Gong Ryong into space to secretly fertilize her egg, where conditions might make conception possible. At first, Gong Ryong flat-out refused. He said the idea of sending human eggs into space went against every protocol. But then the chairman revealed something shocking. His son's sperm had already been sent to the space station. All Gong Ryong had to do was bring the egg. The chairman even went so far as to get on his knees and beg. He promised that if Gong Ryong succeeded in giving him a grandson, he would seriously consider approving his relationship with Gon. Still, Gong Ryong said no. Later, he met with Min Jiang, hoping to convince her to drop this insane idea. But she was even more committed than the chairman. She wasn't just the chairman's daughter-in-law. She was also Gong Ryong's colleague, a pediatrician who deeply loved children. With tears in her eyes, she begged him to help her become a mother. Moved by her sincerity, Gong Ryong finally agreed to the secret mission. Min Jiang's egg was carefully hidden inside a vanilla ice cream cup. Now in space, Gong Ryong passed out the ice creams to the crew, each flavor matched to their favorite taste. 2 were left over, including the vanilla one. But then, something unexpected happened. Eve picked the vanilla ice cream. Panicking, Gong Ryong chased after her and asked her to give it back. But Eve became suspicious. According to mission rules, everyone had to declare all personal items they brought into space. Eve had seen Gong Ryong's item list, and the vanilla ice cream wasn't on it. He tried to cover it up, saying it was a last-minute snack he accidentally packed. "Just a small cup," he said. "Nothing serious." But Eve didn't buy it. She suspected he was hiding something dangerous. To be safe, she threw the cup into the oven to melt it and inspect what was inside. Gong Ryong freaked out and tried to stop her, but then Eve pulled a gun on him. She took a spoonful of the melted ice cream and ran it through a testing device. The results came back, 100% safe, no toxins. Eve, satisfied, handed the spoon back to Gong Ryong and told him to eat it. Trying to avoid suspicion, he nervously swallowed it. But right after, she took the empty cup from him and said something that made his heart drop. "In space, we reduce waste." Then, without hesitation, she threw the entire cup into the trash. Gong Ryong gasped and dove for the cup, snatching it from the bag. He opened the bottom, only to find that Min Jiang's egg was missing. What he didn't know was that the real vanilla ice cream cup, the one with the egg, was now in the hands of Kong Su, Gon's ex. Kong Su not only had the egg, he also had the sperm that had been sent up earlier. Back on Earth, Gon had finally uncovered the truth. Her father had lied. Gong Ryong was never meant to be part of the embryo experiment. He was just a delivery man tricked into transporting the egg inside the ice cream. The chairman never trusted him, and never truly intended for Gong Ryong to marry his daughter. Now desperate, Gong Ryong searched every corner of the space station for the egg. Then Gon called him and explained everything. Furious, Gong Ryong went straight to confront Kong Su. But Kong Su casually pushed him away with one hand, sending him spinning through the air like a rag doll. Kong Su wasn't done. He mocked Gong Ryong, calling him poor, pathetic, and completely unworthy of marrying someone like Gon, a rich heiress. He told Gong Ryong to stop dreaming. "Gon and I are the ones truly meant to be together," he said. Kong Su wasn't just a scientist. He specialized in fruit fly genetics and infertility research. On top of that, he was also the heir to a global banking empire. But Gong Ryong wasn't someone who gave up easily. He had already made a private deal with the chairman. He would build a fertility clinic in space to help people struggling to have children. Motivated by this dream, Gong Ryong entered his second day aboard the space station. Suddenly, an alarm went off. One of the experimental mice, a female labeled mouse number 1, was violently biting the other two. Ground control gave the order, euthanize the aggressive mouse. But Eve hesitated. The thought of taking a life, even a mouse's, in the silence of space terrified her. Before she could decide, mouse number 1 suffered a heart attack. Everyone panicked. Gong Ryong immediately stepped forward and suggested an open heart surgery on the mouse, a procedure he'd done over 100 times on newborn babies back on Earth. With Eve's permission, he rushed into action, doing chest compressions on the tiny heart as the mouse's breathing slowed. Kong Su stood nearby, mocking him with sarcasm. But Gong Ryong wasn't affected. To him, this dying mouse reflected his own situation, weak, hopeless, but still fighting. That connection gave him strength. He and Eve took turns doing compressions. And miraculously, the mouse's heartbeat came back. Eve was so overwhelmed with joy that she hugged Gong Ryong tightly, tears running down her face. She called him the most amazing doctor, and for the first time, she let him call her by her real name, not just Commander. Gong Ryong's heart pounded as he looked into her eyes. He couldn't shake her smile or the way she looked at him. That day, the scientists and crew were resting. Kong Su suggested watching the lottery results together. Eve headed to the lounge to find Gong Ryong. Gong Ryong was staring at a photo of his girlfriend Gon, but in his mind he kept replaying the moment Eve hugged him. Eventually, everyone gathered around a screen to watch the lottery. During the show, Kong Su offered to get coffee for the group. But that was just a cover. While everyone was distracted, Kong Su snuck into the lab to begin the egg fertilization process with the materials Gong Ryong had unknowingly brought to space. After some quick experiments, Kong Su successfully stabilized the sperm in zero gravity and secretly fertilized 7 eggs before anyone noticed. He immediately called the chairman to report the good news. He was confident that these 7 eggs would become 7 heirs, 7 grandchildren. The chairman felt like he had made the right decision trusting Kong Su over Gong Ryong. Meanwhile, Gong Ryong was planning a move of his own. He snuck into the frozen storage area to steal the fertilized eggs, but he had no idea what the passcode was to unlock the freezer. At that moment, Eve made an announcement. The team would be doing a spacewalk the next day to repair a damaged solar panel. To Gong Ryong, This was the perfect opportunity to create a distraction and steal back the eggs. Eve then told him that Kong-soo would also be outside during the spacewalk. That meant the lab would be empty for a few hours, just enough time for Gong Ryong to act. Excited, Gong Ryong asked if spacewalks were dangerous enough that someone might not return. Eve answered seriously, yes. Spacewalking was extremely risky. Even experienced astronauts wrote their wills before doing it. A tiny hole in a glove could lead to death in under 2 minutes. Eve herself would also be going out there. Gong Ryong was instantly worried. Before they had left for space, Eve had told him that going on a spacewalk was like choosing to die. But now she had to do it. He told her that as their leader, she needed to believe she would survive, not just accept death. Eve brushed him off, calling him annoying, but secretly his concern warmed her heart. That night, Eve quietly began writing her will. Meanwhile, Kong-soo was on a video call with Gon. She wasn't having it. Furious, Gon called him out. She told him he was shameless and demanded that he return Min Jang's egg to Gong Ryong. She said this mission was something Gong Ryong should have completed, not him. But Kong-soo refused. And not only that, he had more plans in store. Goen was furious. She couldn't believe Kanu dared to compete with Gong Ryong. On the phone, she exploded, yelling every curse word she could think of. But surprisingly, Kong-soo wasn't offended. In fact, the angrier Goen got, the more he found her attractive. Goen was shocked she had ever loved such a low-quality guy. She swore that once he returned, she'd teach him a proper lesson. Meanwhile, the astronauts were getting ready for their next mission. Gong Ryong quietly sneaked to the freezer again, but he still didn't know the password. Desperate, he called a doctor friend back on Earth and explained the situation. Someone had taken a woman's eggs and he needed advice. His friend heard the sound of the centrifuge spinning and warned that if it overheated, it could explode. That explosion would kill the power and the freezer would open automatically for safety. So Gong Ryong came up with a risky plan. He would run on the treadmill until it sparked a fire and set off the alarm. His doctor friend told him it was extremely dangerous. But Gong Ryong didn't care. This was the only way to get Minyoung's eggs back. At the same time, Eve had just printed her final letter. She noticed a test tube under the computer and excitedly went to find Gong Ryong. She also saw Goen's pictures hanging in both Gong Ryong's and Kong-soo's rooms. She realized Goen was lucky, 2 men were in love with her. Then, Eve handed the test tube to Gong Ryong. Inside were results from 2 flies mating, and in space that's a big deal. Eve was thrilled like a little kid. Life forming in zero gravity was no joke. Eve warned Gong Ryong, Kong-soo must not find out about the flies. If he did, he'd treat them like lab rats. Gong Ryong promised that Kong-soo wouldn't take anything else from him. Eve noticed Gong Ryong acting nervous and teased him. Gong Ryong said he hoped they could meet again on Earth, with real gravity. Eve smiled gently and gave him her will, just in case she didn't survive the mission. Then they both looked at the test tube, where the flies were about to reproduce. Eve laughed with joy, and Gong Ryong felt genuinely happy too. Finally, it was time for the spacewalk. As Eve and Kong-soo headed out, Gong Ryong made his move toward the cold storage unit. He called Minyoung and asked if she wanted Kanu in charge of her eggs. Thankfully, she didn't trust Kanu, she trusted Gong Ryong, She wanted him to monitor the embryo and promised to convince the chairman to let him handle the procedure. That gave Gong Ryong confidence. He was now determined to recover the eggs no matter what. After the call, he put his plan in motion and started running hard on the treadmill. Meanwhile, Eve and Kong-soo were outside the station repairing the solar panels. After hours of work, they were almost done when Kong-soo's glove malfunctioned. Ground control told him to go back right away, and Eve urged him to, staying out longer would be risky. With the big tasks complete, Eve stayed to finish up. Kong-soo returned to the station. Then, an alarm blared through the ship. Gong Ryong's extreme workout had overheated the treadmill, just as planned. The emergency system kicked in, cutting the power and unlocking the lab's freezer. Gong Ryong quickly grabbed the eggs and hid them inside his music player. Since there was no real fire, only smoke, the alarm shut off a few minutes later and the power came back. The rest of the crew didn't suspect anything. Gong Ryong was finally able to relax, relieved to have saved Minyoung's eggs. Back outside, Eve continued repairing the solar panels. But she made a mistake, one of her tools slipped and floated into space. It could have hit the station and caused serious damage. So Eve reached out to grab it, but she slipped too. Now she was drifting in space, extremely dangerous. She used her safety tether to try and grab onto the solar panel. But in the process, her glove got torn by sharp metal parts. The crew inside tried to help, but she was too far away. If this kept going, she'd run out of oxygen in minutes. And the hole in her glove kept getting worse. Her suit started warning her that oxygen levels were dropping fast. At that same moment, Gong Ryong read the farewell letter Eve had left him. In it, she talked about the most important person in her life, her adoptive father, an American astronaut. He had died during a spacewalk while saving another astronaut. Before his death, he had also written her a final letter. In the big, endless universe, all life is equal and precious. Humans aren't gods. Because of someone's dying wish, Eve learned how important it is to care for all living things. In her final message, everything she wrote was about life. She told Gong to take care of the injured crew members, the lab mice, and even reminded him about small things, like eating chili paste and managing waste in zero gravity. She believed every human action was connected to life. But most of all, she told Gong Ryong to stay where he was, to stay alive. She wanted him to value his life. If he followed her instructions, she promised that one day, if she returned to Earth, she'd invite him for a drink. Gong followed her words exactly, until something terrible happened. The space station sent out an emergency signal. He quickly checked Eve's status, and it was bad. Because of how far away she was, she couldn't reach the robotic arm anymore. She lay motionless on the solar panel, her oxygen running low. She was slipping out of consciousness. Mission Control tried to help, but there wasn't much they could do from Earth. Everyone was watching, scared, as Eve's life was in real danger. Suddenly, a hatch opened inside the space station. Gong Ryong had disobeyed her last wish. Even though he was just a tourist with no training, he put on a space suit and went outside into space. But he didn't know how to handle space properly. He skipped the decompression process, which could kill him. Half his body was hanging in open space, but he didn't care. He just kept going. He shouted Eve's name as loud as he could, trying to wake her up. She barely heard him but managed to open her eyes and pointed to the tether, her only hope. Seeing this, Eve shed a silent tear, but she also found the strength to guide him. Gong followed her direction and slowly reached the tether. He grabbed it and pulled her back to the station before they both ran out of oxygen. Later, after a full night of recovery and oxygen, Eve finally woke up. Her first memory? Gong risking his life for her. Not long after, Gong woke up too. He called a friend back on Earth to let them know he was safe. That's when he found out. His girlfriend had announced their engagement publicly, without telling him first. She had told the media that when Gong came back, they would get married. But instead of being happy, Gong was only thinking about Eve. At the space station, Gong and Eve took turns using the bathroom. Seeing that Eve was okay made Gong smile. But right then, Eve slapped him. She was angry. She explained clearly that, as an astronaut, she was ready to sacrifice herself if needed, but he wasn't. He was a civilian. And as the mission commander, she couldn't allow him to die too. Gong couldn't argue. He apologized and promised not to break rules again. Eve then told him something even harsher. Until they returned to Earth, he wasn't allowed to do anything reckless or even talk to her. Gong begged her to reconsider. After all, the space station was tiny. How could he avoid her entirely? But Eve didn't care. She coldly turned away. What Gong didn't know was that Eve had her own reasons. When she was alone, looking out at the stars, she felt overwhelmed. She couldn't stop thinking about Gong's gentle eyes. Later, Gong got confronted by Ku again. Ku reminded him that he had broken the rules and should be punished. Gong didn't back down. He told Ku he had already retrieved Minjiang's eggs. But Ku revealed something shocking. The experiment was already over. Out of the 7 eggs, 6 had already developed successfully. Hearing this crushed Gong even more. But in truth, Ku was also feeling bitter. He had seen the news about Gong's engagement being announced without his consent. That night, Gong went to ask the 2 remaining astronauts if he could sleep in their quarters. They not only said yes, but also pulled out some secret liquor they'd been hiding. They offered to drink with Gong to help him forget his stress. Before sleeping, they gave him the rest of the alcohol, calling him a hero. After they left, Gong floated alone in zero gravity, sipping the drink. For the first time in a while, he felt a little better. Maybe because he drank too much, Gong couldn't sleep. He started wandering around the station, giving random advice to scientists. He told one of them to use mice to find a cure for Alzheimer's. Then he went to Mina. Mina had recently found a winning lottery ticket worth 5 trillion won. It belonged to Ku, but he didn't know. Her sister told her to sew it into her underwear and cash it when she returned to Earth. Gong suddenly showed up and caught her trying to hide the ticket. Mina panicked and lied, saying she planned to return it. But Gong told her not to be too honest. Ku already had millions and wouldn't care. He promised to keep her secret if she helped him with something later. Later, Gong sneaked into the lab to try conducting the embryo experiment himself. But with zero gravity, even the eggs wouldn't stay still. He had to give up. At the end of the corridor, he saw Eve's room. He took a deep breath and walked in. Turns out, Eve was awake too. She had been listening to his footsteps. Gong looked at her with soft eyes, like a kid asking for praise. Eve smelled the alcohol and was about to scold him, but Gong spoke first. He asked her, "Can I like you?" Eve avoided his eyes. Gong looked so sincere. He didn't even know when he started falling for her. After a short pause, Eve gave a clear answer. No. She thought he was just drunk and joking. And besides, both of them already had partners back on Earth. But Gong was serious. He told her he'd be back on Earth in just a few days. Gong Ryong was about to leave, but he still hoped Eve would give him an answer before he did. Eve, however, coldly pushed him out of her room. But after he left, she grew anxious. She quietly opened her door and peeked outside. He was still there. Gong Ryong figured she must be curious about him. As an OBGYN doctor, he was mostly surrounded by pregnant patients and medical cases. But Eve was different. She was the only one who truly touched his heart. Still, Eve turned him down. She didn't want anything to do with the fiancé of a Kailaris. Gong Ryong promised her that once he returned to Earth, he'd end things with his girlfriend. He asked her, if a year later, her own boyfriend was gone or not better than him, would she consider giving him a chance? But Eve firmly ordered him not to fall for her. She even bluntly told him he wasn't as good as her current boyfriend. Gong Ryong was heartbroken. What he didn't know was that the woman who just rejected him had a heart beating wildly for him. Meanwhile, back on Earth, former spaceship commander Ta he looked at an old photo. It was of her, Eve, and Eve's ex-boyfriend Dong Ma. Ta he had once led Eve and Dong Ma on a space mission. One day during that mission, Dong Ma had taken her hand and jokingly asked for the watch on her wrist. He also gently comforted Eve, who was nervous during her first space trip. Dong Ma told Eve that space suited her well. Watching that moment back, Ta he felt jealous because she had always had feelings for Dong Ma. Sighing, Ta he backed her car up, thinking happiness wasn't meant for her anymore. Suddenly, Dong Ma jumped into her car uninvited. He said he was about to resign and leave ground control. Ta he told him plainly she didn't want him to go. Back on the space station, Gong Ryong kept his word. He called Go-eun his fiancé. Go-eun thought he was angry at her for announcing their engagement without telling him. But Gong Ryong calmly told her he wasn't good enough for her, and he wouldn't go through with the engagement. Go-eun was devastated and in a foul mood the next day. But instead of giving up, she became more determined to have Gong Ryong. She even knelt in front of her father, the chairman, inside an elevator, begging to be allowed to be with Gong Ryong. The chairman noticed that Gong Ryong didn't love his daughter. So he advised her to consider Kong Soo instead, someone who truly cared for her. Meanwhile, Min Jang asked Gong Ryong's friend about the experiment's progress. The friend said it was going well. Gong Ryong had retrieved the eggs, and the procedure was ready. Min Jang was relieved. Just then, the chairman called her to a meeting. The Academy of Sciences had analyzed Kong Soo's experiment. Out of 7 eggs, 6 had been fertilized. The chairman was overjoyed. He believed he had chosen the right person to trust. He then asked Min Jang to choose Kong Soo or Gong Ryong. He also mentioned that the embryos could be implanted into a uterus as soon as that night. Min Jang hesitated but ended up choosing Kong Soo. Even though she often opposed the chairman, her desire to have a child of her own was stronger. That evening, Gong Ryong got a call from Min Jang. He was still feeling positive and ready to begin the IVF procedure. But Min Jang coldly told him to stop. She warned him that if he was caught, it could ruin Kong Soo's experiment. Once again, Gong Ryong felt crushed. He wished he could return to Earth right away. Eve was also heartbroken. She video-called her boyfriend, Dong Ma. But what she saw shocked her, women's underwear scattered in the room. Dong Ma was in bed with Ta He. Thinking the call had disconnected, the two got intimate. During it, Ta He asked Dong Ma about his feelings for Eve. He said Eve didn't understand men at all. Eve's heart shattered. She angrily asked Gong Ryong where he hid the alcohol. Still mad, Gong Ryong lied and said he didn't know. Eve snapped. She cursed all men, saying once they took off their pants, they were nothing but animals. Gong Ryong thought she was referring to him and told her to stop. At that moment, Ta He, who had just slept with Dong Ma, walked up to Eve. Eve almost cursed her out but held back. Ta He acted like nothing had happened and reminded Eve to fulfill her duties as commander. Meanwhile, scientist Mina contacted her sister on Earth. She was worried that Gong Riyong had seen her pick up a lottery ticket, one worth 5 trillion. She feared he might not keep it a secret. And worse, what if Kong Su found out she had stolen his ticket? Unluckily, another scientist, Sung Jun, overheard the conversation. Hearing the amount, he started fantasizing about being showered in money. Mina's anxiety pushed her to return the ticket to Kong Su. But just as she was about to, Sung Jun showed up and changed the topic quickly to distract her. Meanwhile, Kong Su, the perfectionist, kept complaining about tiny things. Mina got angry when he bragged about being rich and snapped at him. So she changed her mind, she wouldn't return the ticket. Sung Jun even secretly told a foreign astronaut about the ticket. Kong Su, meanwhile, still had no idea he had won. He had just finished examining all 7 embryos. He confirmed they were perfectly healthy and ready to be frozen and returned to Earth. He called the chairman to share the great news. The chairman was thrilled and asked for photos. He wanted to see his future grandchildren in space. Back at the station, Eve, devastated by her boyfriend's betrayal, found half a bottle of alcohol hidden by Gong Riyong. She planned to drink until she forgot everything. At the same time, Kong Su finished checking the embryos' genders, both boys and girls. He proudly told the chairman that he'd be having both grandsons and granddaughters. He even sent him the photos. Just then, Eve burst into the room. After placing the fertilized embryos into the incubator, Eve, a very serious and careful scientist, noticed something odd. She saw that the oxygen and temperature levels inside the incubation chamber weren't suitable for fruit flies. Eve always believed that Kong Su was researching fruit flies. But then she saw images on his computer, not of fruit flies but of fertilized eggs. Kong Su quickly lied, claiming they were just cell division images from fruit flies. But Eve knew biology too well. She immediately recognized that those were human embryos, not insect ones. That's when she realized Kong Su was using the fruit fly project as a cover to secretly run illegal human embryo experiments, a big violation of space law. Eve confronted him and demanded he open the incubation box right away. With no other choice, Kong Su obeyed. When the other astronauts checked, they confirmed, yes, these were real human fertilized eggs. Eve asked Kong Su how he managed to bring human eggs into the space station and who they belonged to. To keep his secret, Kong Su made up a story. He said the eggs were donated by a bank and hidden under a glass bottle before secretly being brought into space. As for the sperm, he falsely claimed it came from a foreign astronaut named Santiago and had been kept in a frozen storage unit. Kong Su believed he was solving the problem of human infertility. But Eve, who strictly followed the rules, insisted the embryos must be destroyed. Kong Su didn't know how to respond. Then Gong Riyong chased after Eve, begging her to stop. He argued that those embryos were already alive and deserved a choice, not just to be thrown away. But Eve strongly disagreed. She said embryos exposed to radiation and space rays could develop in unpredictable ways. So she angrily tossed the embryos into the disposal unit. Gong was heartbroken. He called Eve a murderer. He once believed that space was like a mother's womb, a place for new life. But after what Eve did, he realized space was a place of death, not life. He even regretted confessing his feelings to her the day before. Eve didn't care. She reported Kong Su's illegal experiment to ground control and asked for his removal. Ground control agreed. Eve would stay as the team leader, but Kong Su was kicked off the mission and lost his astronaut license. Eve also took away his microscope. From now on, no one could use it without her permission, and all experiments had to be recorded. Back on Earth, the chairman knew nothing about this. He was still happy, planning for his daughter to break up with Gong Riyong and preparing to pass his company down to his future grandson. Meanwhile, Kong Su called to inform him of what happened in space. Although Gong Riyong had secretly kept a few embryos from Kong Su, they couldn't be used without the microscope. When the chairman heard this, he went from happy to devastated and even fainted from the shock. Luckily, he was okay when he woke up. He told his daughter to contact Gong Riyong, hoping he could still use the remaining embryos. But Gaon, his daughter, refused to help. She feared Gong Riyong would get in trouble too. Min Yong, the chairman's assistant, was deeply disappointed and gave up hope. Still, Gong Riyong didn't give up. He had 3 eggs left, and in 3 days he would return to Earth. But it also took 3 days for embryos to develop. That night was his only chance. Without a microscope, Gong planned to use a micropipette to perform the fertilization. The biggest challenge? The zero gravity in space. He couldn't stay still, which made it nearly impossible to inject the sperm accurately. Gong called his friend on Earth for help. His friend gave him a simple idea: just ask a few people to hold him in place. Right then, Sung-joon overheard that Mina had found a winning lottery ticket. They made a deal. They'd split it into 3 parts. One for Santiago, since only he was returning to Earth soon enough to cash it. Mina hesitated, but eventually agreed. After some discussion, the 3 of them, Mina, Sung-joon and Santiago, agreed to help Gong Ryong. In exchange, Gong would keep the ticket a secret from Kong-soo. Santiago, however, was still unsure and asked Gong why he needed their help. Gong finally told them the truth. He was trying to conduct a human embryo experiment. The others panicked. They were scared of losing their jobs, just like Kong-soo. But Gong reminded them of the 5 trillion won lottery ticket and begged them not to throw away this golden chance. Santiago was the first to say yes. He revealed something personal, like the chairman's son, he had fertility issues. His sperm was unhealthy and he couldn't have children. Every day, he'd just look at magazines while collecting samples for experiments. Deep down, he really wanted a child. From that perspective, he supported Gong's mission. Soon, Mina and Sung-joon agreed too. That night, while Eve was asleep, Gong Ryong quietly left his room. With everyone in position, Santiago and Sung-joon holding his legs, and Mina keeping watch, the experiment began. Because he was fixed in place, Gong Ryong successfully collected the sperm. But the pipette kept shaking. The first egg was pierced and died. Now he only had 2 eggs left. On the second try, Gong was extra careful. He managed to grab the egg with the pipette. Then he tried injecting the sperm. But he pushed too hard, the sperm missed and leaked outside the egg. The second egg failed too. Now only 1 last egg remained. This time, Gong needed to inject the sperm perfectly right into the center. As he was about to do it, Eve suddenly appeared. Just earlier, Gong had helped her choose mice for her experiments. That night, Eve had woken up to check on them and found the 2 mice mating. Excited, she came to share the moment. Eve got some good news. Gong wasn't in the resting chamber, so she started searching in the astronauts' lounge instead. Mina, who was in charge of keeping the area cool, quickly took control of the situation while reminding everyone to stay alert. Santiago and Sung-joon heard the noise and rushed to hide Gong Ryong, along with the sperm and eggs. When Eve walked in, they acted like nothing was wrong. Unexpectedly, Eve thought they were secretly drinking alcohol and decided to check the room. As she reached for the spacesuit where Gong Ryong was hiding, Sung-joon stopped her just in time. He admitted they'd been drinking and apologized. Luckily, Eve didn't push further and left. The crisis was avoided. After she left, Gong Ryong got back to his experiment. He carefully placed the eggs at the tips of 2 pipettes so they would fall perfectly in the center of the culture dish. Everyone held their breath as Gong Ryong stayed laser-focused under the pressure. Finally, he succeeded. The sperm was injected into the egg. It was a huge moment for him. Now, all they had to do was wait for the embryos to grow. While waiting, Gong Ryong went to talk to Eve. Their eyes met, and Eve remembered how, before this mission, ground control had told her to take care of Gong Ryong. She had immediately refused, thinking he didn't know anything about space. Now, though, Eve smiled. Through a camera, Donga happened to see the sweet moment between them while checking on the test mice. Seeing their closeness, Donga stared nervously at the cigarette in his hand. Then, Tahi walked over and kissed him suddenly. A few days earlier, Tahi had come to Eve's house to help her turn off the TV. When she saw Donga there, she flirted with him and said it was hot, even taking off her jacket on purpose. Donga understood the hint and they became intimate, right there in his girlfriend's house. Back to the present, Tahi kissed Donga again with passion. But unexpectedly, Donga told her he was just confused because he was thinking of quitting his job. Although the astronauts had helped Gong Ryong, they later felt what they did wasn't right. To protect their honor, they decided to give the lottery ticket back to Kong-soo. That night, Eve got a call from ground control. They had detected the space station drifting toward a big cloud of space debris. The chances of a collision were 1 in 10,000. Still, ground control told Eve to get ready. Eve quickly adjusted the station's orbit and avoided the debris safely. Later that night, while Eve slept, Gong Ryong quietly left his chamber to pray for the embryos to grow successfully. After praying, he noticed Eve's foot had no bandages. Worried, he gently scolded her for not taking care of herself. Since she was sleeping deeply, Gong Ryong bandaged her foot himself. Watching her peaceful face, his mind drifted back to a year ago. He remembered overhearing Eve mock him, saying he didn't understand life in space and that she'd have to be his caretaker. Back then, Gong had promised he wouldn't be a burden. Now, though, looking at her sleeping, he realized she was right. He had caused her a lot of trouble. Yet, in that quiet moment, he confessed his feelings. He wanted to go back to Earth and do normal things with her. Go on walks, eat together, watch movies like a regular couple. After his quiet confession, Gong Ryong checked on the embryo again and saw it was developing perfectly. Excited, he called Min Young to share the news. The embryo just needed 2 more days in the incubator before it could be taken to Earth. Just yesterday, Min Young had been in despair and tried to end her life, but luckily she was found and taken to the hospital in time. Before Gong called, she was still unconscious. But now she was awake. The chairman, overjoyed, saw Gong Ryong as the hero who saved his family. Unfortunately, Koo overheard Gong Ryong's call. Kong Soo, who always looked down on Gong, was shocked to see him succeed at something he couldn't do himself. He even tried to open the incubator but didn't know the password. Gong didn't care about Kong Soo and went to eat breakfast with the others. During breakfast, Eve jokingly repeated the sweet words Gong had said to her the night before. Turns out, she hadn't been asleep. She heard everything he said and remembered his kind words. Suddenly, Kong Soo stormed in, furious. He grabbed Gong Ryong and demanded to know how he managed to inject sperm into the egg without using a microscope. The astronauts quickly held Koo back before he could reveal the embryo. While chaos broke out, another piece of space debris appeared. This time, it directly hit their adjusted orbit. Ground control sounded the alarm and immediately reinstated Koo as an astronaut. All crew members were ordered to evacuate to the escape pod. As commander, Eve stayed calm and gave clear instructions. They needed to move fruit flies and essential animals like lab mice to the cargo ship. She also reminded Gong to bring his personal stuff. Gong rushed to the incubator to save the embryos, but it had auto-locked due to the emergency. He grabbed a tool and tried to open it. At that moment, Koo appeared again and told Gong to give up. The fertilized eggs hadn't even turned into embryos yet. Desperate, Gong asked if the escape pod had a power source, since embryos need electricity to grow. Gong Ryong refused to leave empty-handed. Seeing his desperation, Koo offered a deal. He said he'd help find power on the escape pod if Gong handed the embryos over to him. Gong agreed but asked Koo to promise never to tell Eve. Koo accepted and walked away calmly to pack. Meanwhile, Gong kept trying to open the tank. After a while, Eve led everyone into the rescue ship. At that same time, space debris crashed again. As the situation got more dangerous, Eve noticed that Gong Ryong still hadn't boarded the escape ship. From Earth, Mission Control ordered an immediate launch and told the astronauts to return home, no more waiting. But Gong Ryong was stuck in the main spacecraft section after a collision, and the rescue ship couldn't contact him anymore. He kept banging on the door, but no one could hear him. Kanu offered to go save him, but ground control warned everyone, the spacecraft cabin had a crack. If anyone opened the door, all the oxygen would leak out. Still, Eve couldn't leave Gong Ryong behind. She decided to go out alone on a dangerous spacewalk to rescue him. People on Earth begged her not to. Donga especially told her to stay calm and think it through. Things were getting more tense by the second. Teehee, back on Earth, promised to send another rescue ship but told the astronauts to leave immediately. When they hesitated, Teehee activated the emergency program, separating the escape pod from the main ship and locking the door remotely. Eve was helpless. Meanwhile, Gong Ryong was doing everything he could to save himself. He tried to contact the pod, but it didn't work. Instead, he picked up a signal from Earth. Watching from the window, he saw the escape ship float away, leaving him behind. He was devastated. But then, out of nowhere, he saw Eve in a spacesuit stepping out of the escape pod toward him. She was spacewalking, risking everything. Just before the pod door shut, she made it out to him. Eve radioed Earth, begging them to reopen the door and promising she would bring Gong back safely. After some hesitation, Mission Control agreed. Thanks to her experience, Eve was able to move smoothly across the outside of the ship. Then, disaster struck again. Huge pieces of space debris started flying toward her. Eve had to find shelter fast while Gong's words echoed in her mind. He wanted to date her, love her, and live a normal life together back on Earth. Eventually, the debris storm passed. Eve continued crawling forward and reached the main door. She and Gong looked at each other through the glass, she smiled. He looked terrified, worried only about her. Once inside, Gong rushed to hug her tightly, crying and apologizing again and again. He blamed himself for everything. But Eve just smiled and reminded him of his love confession. She said when they returned, they'd have so many happy memories. Gong looked at her with so much love. Then Eve took off her helmet, letting her long hair fall, and Gong kissed her, in space. She couldn't hide how she felt anymore. While they waited for instructions from Earth, Gong secretly wrote something on his phone and showed it to her to avoid Mission Control seeing. On Earth, Dolma watched and felt upset. Seeing that, Teehee got jealous too, speaking with sadness in her voice. Back in space, Eve and Gong waited. Then, another disaster. The escape ship exploded from an oxygen leak. Their only way home was destroyed. They were trapped. Eve contacted Earth again. A rescue ship would come, but Earth needed her to check how much power was left. She found out the solar panels had burned out, so they had to rely only on emergency backup, maybe 2 days' worth. Earth told her to switch to full emergency mode. Eve shut down all non-essential systems to save power. Back on Earth, people were panicking. News broke about the emergency evacuation. Gong, unaware of the tragedy, told his private airline to pick up Gong personally. The chairman was thrilled, thinking the embryos were developing well, and told his daughter to go fetch her future husband and grandchildren. But right as Gong was getting ready, a news report aired. Teehee, now on camera, told the truth. Gong Ryong and Eve were still stuck in space. The others, including Kanu, had safely landed in the ocean. Mission Control promised to work with international space programs to get a rescue ship up fast. Gong immediately called Kanu, who had just been taken to a hospital. Furious, Gong yelled at him for leaving Gong behind and told him to return to space to bring them back. Dolma, worried about Eve, said he would go himself. He didn't care if he died, he'd do anything for her. Seeing this, Teehee became furious. She slapped Dolma across the face, telling him he'd die if he tried, but Dolma didn't care. He was even ready to cancel his resignation and swore no one could stop him from saving Eve. Back in space, Gong Ryong saw the fertilized embryo growing healthily. All that was left was getting it back to Earth so it could be implanted in a womb. He hid the embryo in a special experimental container. Eve followed Earth's instructions, cut the power, and activated emergency systems. She even turned off the dehumidifier, which meant temperatures would drop fast. Soon, the space station turned almost completely dark, and the temperature dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. They had been trapped for 30 hours. Power was about to run out. To stay alive, Eve decided to cut communication with Earth and use the last remaining energy to recharge her suit, keeping only the oxygen generator working. Eve begged Earth not to give up on them. With a tearful goodbye, she pleaded for help, but soon the communication was cut and Mission Control fell silent. Although Taehui had promised Eve that a rescue would launch within 30 hours, Earth still wasn't ready due to technical problems. Everyone at Mission Control was anxious. They knew even if a rescue launched later, Gong Ryong would run out of oxygen by then. Taehui still refused to let Dongma replace the robot to go to space. She couldn't bear the thought of him risking his life. Back in the space station, Eve found 2 cold-proof tents and crawled inside one with Gong Ryong to keep warm. But the temperature kept dropping fast. Gong Ryong's body began to freeze up, his limbs were going numb. Eve gave him a bottle of alcohol to drink. He took a few sips, and while it didn't do much, it helped just a little. She suggested watching a movie to kill time, but his phone died by accident. Still, Eve gave Gong hope. If they made it back to Earth alive, she wanted to go to the movies with him. Gong smiled at that. He thought about telling her his secret, that the fertilized egg had become an embryo but decided to hold back. Soon, Eve's legs started cramping from the cold. Worried, Gong crawled out of his tent to help her, massaging her legs. But without shelter, Eve was scared he'd freeze. So she told him to come into her tent instead. They huddled together, trying to stay warm. Suddenly, Eve mentioned that removing their clothes could help preserve body heat. After a few more sips of alcohol, they undressed and clung to each other for warmth. Gong finally opened up. He told Eve the real reason he went to space and revealed that the embryo had already started forming. But instead of getting angry, Eve only worried about the embryo's survival. If they didn't make it back, 3 lives would be lost in space. Still, she encouraged him not to lose hope. Even if they died, Earth would definitely send a ship to bring the embryo back and save it. Gong was moved. He kissed Eve. In that painful moment, being able to hold her made him feel complete, even if they died. By now, Gong and Eve had been trapped for 40 hours. Meanwhile, Dongma packed his bags and went to the emergency command center, ready to stay overnight. The rescue team gathered to discuss the situation. Oxygen and power on the station were running dangerously low. If they didn't act today, Gong and Eve might not survive. Dongma arrived holding the humanoid robot model. The original plan was to send the robot into space for the rescue. But Dongma believed it wasn't ready and couldn't pilot a ship properly. Taehui was completely against sending Dongma instead of the robot. She didn't want him risking his life like that. Back on the space station, the embryo had already begun dividing into cells. The chairman of the big corporation was thrilled. All they needed now was Gong to come back and protect the family bloodline. He was determined to save Gong, his future son-in-law. But Gong's friend overheard the chairman's plans and frowned. Gong had once promised him that even if he married Gaewon, he would still work as an obstetrician and not chase money. When asked if he was happy, Gong had stayed silent. Now, Gong and Eve only had 10 hours left. Feeling desperate, Gaewon angrily demanded that Tae-hui explain herself. She said that in emergencies, VIPs should be evacuated first. Tae-hui promised they'd launch the rescue soon, but Gaewon didn't buy it. She wanted a specific launch time. When Tae-hui couldn't give her one, Gaewon declared she was bringing Gong's 3 mothers to the command center to wait together. The mothers were already panicked after hearing Gong was trapped in space. In their stress, the first mom accidentally turned on a gas stove and caused a fire. The second mom tried to help but poured water on it, making the fire worse. Gaewon arrived just in time with a fire extinguisher and put out the flames. She got minor burns on her arm but wasn't seriously hurt. The 3 mothers felt terrible and were scared Gong would blame them or that Gaewon would be mad. But she didn't blame anyone. Instead, she asked them to come to the command center with her and support Gong together. Just then, the secretary announced that the rescue ship was finally getting ready. Before this, Dongma had begged to go instead of the robot. Given the urgent situation, Tae-hui finally agreed. But there was another problem: the space station systems were broken. Even if Dongma reached it, docking would be hard. To fix that, the team planned to attach 2 robotic arms to the rescue ship to help it connect with the station. These arms were in Spain and cost a lot of money. So Tae-hui contacted astronaut Santiago from Spain, who agreed to help get them. The cost would be paid by Kong-soo, heir to a massive global bank. For him, money wasn't an issue. He told Santiago not to worry about the price, he'd handle everything. With that, the arms were secured and the rescue ship was ready. Before the launch, Tae-hui reminded Dongma to stay calm and follow all the rules. One mistake could mean death. Dongma understood and promised to be careful. Tae-hui, though heartbroken, gave Dongma her watch and put it on his wrist. She knew his heart wasn't with her anymore and just prayed he'd return alive. As Dongma got into the ship, Santiago and 4 other astronauts came to the command center, hoping to see Gong return. But since they had just come back from space, they collapsed while walking. They still couldn't adjust to Earth's gravity and had to be taken away in wheelchairs. Only Kong-soo kept his eyes on Gaewon. Meanwhile, Dongma was already seated. As the countdown ended, the spaceship launched. But as it climbed higher, the ship shook badly. One of the robotic arms fell off. Then, even worse news came. The space station's life support system had completely shut down. That meant Gong had no oxygen left to breathe. Dongma carefully piloted the rescue ship toward the space station. Thanks to his astronaut experience, he expertly used the robotic arm to grab the station. But the problem was, one arm wasn't strong enough. One small mistake and they'd fall out of orbit. Still, Dongma managed to connect the docking device. After some tense moments, the rescue ship successfully linked to the station. He opened the hatch and entered. It was freezing inside. While searching, he found Gong Ryong trapped. When Dongma called his name, Gong Ryong slowly opened his eyes. He was alive. As Dongma kept looking around, he saw something weird: women's underwear floating. He followed it and found Eve, hidden in a thermal sleeping bag. But what shocked Dongma? Eve and Gong Ryong were inside the bag, completely naked, holding each other tight. Just then, a command center call snapped Dongma back to reality. He shouted Eve's name and thankfully she woke up, barely breathing. Dongma quickly carried both Eve and Gong back to the rescue ship and helped them put on survival suits. Eve was surprised to see Dongma, and Gong Ryong had already spoken to his mom at the command center. Gaewon finally felt relieved. She couldn't wait to see Gong Ryong back on Earth. While she confessed her love, Camus stood silently nearby, sighing to himself. Once everything was ready, Dongma flew them back to Earth. But it wasn't smooth. Since the suits weren't customized, the re-entry caused extreme heat and vibrations. The spacecraft shook violently like it was on fire. Just in time, Dongma released the parachute and the ship landed in the ocean. For a few moments, all communication was lost. The command center fell silent, fearing the worst. But then, good news. The ship resurfaced. Everyone was safe. Dongma's voice came through the radio, and the command center erupted with joy. Even Kansu sighed in relief. On board the ship, Dongma, Eve, and Gong Ryong were crying from happiness. Back on Earth, reporters swarmed them with questions. Dongma didn't hide anything. He admitted he loved Eve, and that he went to space not just to save Gong Ryong, but to save the woman he loved. Reporters also asked about Gong Ryong and Gaewon's wedding plans. They were dying to know how Gong and Eve survived up there. Turns out, Eve had found a few oxygen tanks that lasted 10 minutes each. In order to survive, Eve and Gong had to strip and huddle naked inside a tent for warmth. While facing death, Gong promised Eve all kinds of things, kissing her every 15 minutes, eating hot cup noodles together, and growing old side by side. They didn't reveal all this to the media, but the public pretty much guessed what had happened. Gaewon, suspecting the truth, sat alone, smoking sadly. Kamu came by and gently took the cigarette from her. Seeing the burn on her arm, he quietly reminded her that her suspicions might not be wrong. After returning to Earth, Gong and Eve were hospitalized to adjust to gravity. Tahi asked Eve why Gong ended up trapped, but Eve chose to protect him. She didn't mention anything about what really happened. Dolma, however, noticed she was lying. Later, when Gong was too weak to undress, Dolma helped him to the bathroom. But suddenly, Dolma dropped the act. He told Gong Ryong to stay away from Eve. Gaewon is mine. Eve is mine too, he said. Gong Ryong didn't argue. Afterward, while struggling to take off his sock, Gong Ryong handed it secretly to the chairman, pretending to vomit. Inside the sock was a frozen box, holding the embryo created from his sperm. The chairman got the message immediately. Gaewon later visited Gong Ryong, happily announcing the embryo was healthy. She kissed him over and over, though he didn't respond much. She asked if anything inappropriate happened in space. Gong Ryong didn't answer directly but told her not to waste time on him. He admitted he once tried to convince himself he'd fall in love with her, but realized during their engagement announcement that he never truly loved her. Gaewon was heartbroken. She cried alone in a stairwell, while Kamu watched quietly from a distance. But then, Gaewon wiped her tears, walked into Gong's room, and told him she didn't believe a word he said. She was sure he loved her. She assumed he was just angry because her father didn't trust him. To win over Gong Ryong's family, she contacted his 3 moms and asked them to call her future daughter-in-law when visiting the hospital. Meanwhile, Kamu forced himself to train hard despite not being fully healed. Suddenly, in a fit of anger, he ripped off his oxygen mask and punched Gong Ryong, wishing he'd die from lack of air. Eve saw this but didn't interfere, just looked worried and helpless. Then Dolma burst into the room. He knelt in front of Eve and slapped Gong Ryong multiple times. Dolma confessed he had cheated with Tahi, but insisted he only ever loved Eve. He begged for forgiveness. Eve didn't blame anyone. Gong Ryong, lying in his bed, witnessed the whole scene. Coincidentally, it was Dolma's birthday. The astronauts threw him a small party. While everyone was distracted, Dolma disassembled a training body model and said he would go to space again himself to perform a rescue. Alone, Dolma cried while rebuilding the body, hoping Eve would wait for him just a little longer. He promised he wouldn't be afraid anymore and he'd never let his girlfriend die again. Eve's eyes filled with tears at his words. Gong Ryong, on the other hand, felt conflicted. Minju also visited Gong and thanked him, saying her life had changed because of him. After everything, Eve was finally able to become a mother. And now, thanks to Gong Ryong's help, millions of infertile couples on Earth had new hope. But Gong didn't feel like a hero. He quietly replied that he wasn't that great, just a speck of dust in the vast universe. Men Young gently encouraged Gong Ryong to have faith in that vast universe. One day, she said, he would find someone who truly loved him. And with her, he'd grow old hand in hand. Meanwhile, Eve sat silently, gazing at the little painting in her hands, a gift Gong Ryong had secretly left on her plate that day. Every cute drawing inside was hand-painted by Gong Ryong himself. One page said, "Do you want to go watch a movie? Maybe take a walk and eat something delicious." Eve smiled. In her mind, she saw it all. Spring. They'd watch a touching film together at the theater. Autumn. They'd stroll through forests full of fallen leaves, taking pictures. Winter. A dinner reservation for hot, comforting dishes. And someday, even get matching haircuts. These were Gong Ryong's simple, beautiful wishes, just to enjoy Earth and life together with Eve. Feeling something stir inside her, Eve went to visit Gong Ryong's hospital room. Even though she had seen Dongma's deep feelings for her, she chose to visit Gong, who was still feeling low. Unexpectedly, she invited him to go out to a convenience store. That night, the two of them in wheelchairs crossed a busy intersection together. It was a quiet, ordinary moment, but for them, it felt like freedom they never had in space. Outside the store, they shared a hot bowl of noodles. Gong Ryong was overwhelmed with happiness. But then Eve spoke. She told Gong they should forget what happened in space. That their kisses and affections were just a dream. Now that they were back on Earth, she had to face Dongma, the man who had risked his life to save her. And Gong had to face Gon, his fiancé. They couldn't hurt the people who truly loved them, not for a few fleeting days in space. Gong couldn't accept this. He felt Eve was just running from her real feelings. Eve looked into Gong's eyes and saw his pain. But she remained firm. After being discharged from the hospital, Eve planned to end things with Gong for good. But when she returned home and saw a magazine cover of her and Gong returning from space, her heart trembled. Meanwhile, Gong was also disturbed. His mother had discovered that he and Eve were naked together in space. She warned him, "No matter the emergency, Gong, never remove your underwear in front of another woman unless it's gone." Gong was torn. He kept remembering Eve's cold words. And yet, her eyes had said something else. Eve had lied. She said what happened with Gong was just an embarrassing one-night stand. And Gong believed her. A few days later, the astronauts came back for medical checkups. Gong returned to work at the hospital. Eve purposely chose Gong's doctor friend for her checkup, avoiding Gong completely. Gong felt crushed. Meanwhile, Gon was crying alone. In the past, Gong had pushed her away, trying to save her from wasting her time. Now, Gon was heartbroken, but determined to win back Gong's heart. At home, Gong kept thinking back to the first time he met Gon. Years ago, he had visited a temple with her family to pray for her deceased brother. Gon's father had demanded she kneel over 1,000 times in penance. But halfway through, he walked away, leaving Gon to finish alone. Even then, she stayed. At one point, Gon boldly played her late brother's favorite song inside the temple, challenging even the Buddha. Gong, shocked, told her it was inappropriate. But Gon replied, "Only a heart with mountains can see mountains." The Buddha isn't angry, he's smiling. Gong thought she was bold, stubborn, smart, and beautiful. After the ritual, Gong sat beside her and confessed his feelings. Gon asked him why he always went to space. Was it to flaunt his family's wealth? Instead of answering, Gong pointed to the stars. He explained constellations, teased her gently, and tried to comfort her grief. It was the first time Gon had smiled after her brother's passing. From that moment, Gong's heart had been with her. Now, Gong went to the restaurant where Gon was dining. She asked directly if Gong and Eve had done anything inappropriate in space. Gong didn't answer. He told her to ask Eve. But he also made one thing clear. He didn't care about Gong and Eve's relationship. He only cared about Gon. A few weeks later, Eve was preparing to go on another space mission. Dongma begged her to refuse. He wanted them to go to the US and rest for a year or two. But Eve didn't just refuse. She told him she didn't want to be his girlfriend anymore. Even though Dongma had saved her life, she couldn't forgive his betrayal. She hoped they could break up peacefully and remain professional colleagues. Dongma was humiliated and furious. He accused her of leaving him for Gong Ryong. But Eve didn't explain. She was done. At the ground command center, Deputy Director Tahi watched the footage of Eve hugging Gong in the space station. Her subordinates whispered, this had to be more than a friendship. Eve wasn't the kind to hug someone just because they were in danger. To confirm, Tahi contacted Gong. She also instructed Eve and Gong to submit personal reports about their final 3 days in the station, every minute accounted for truthfully. Eve specifically told Gong, "Don't write about the kiss." But Gong, still bitter, replied that he didn't remember what she said. Back home, he sat at his computer. But every time he tried to write, his mind was filled with their memories in space. He couldn't write a word. Eve called to check on him, worried he might say something inappropriate in the report. Gong brushed her off. Eve called again, trying to help, offering to double-check the report details. But Gong, still hurt, hung up again. A few days later, Eve kept calling Gong, asking about the report. Gong found every excuse not to talk. Then, Eve looked at the mice from space, the ones they had experimented on. Their stitches were still neat and perfect. Gong's work. In front of her colleagues, Eve praised the stitching, but what she really missed was the man who had done them. Later, at a celebration dinner for the astronauts, everyone gathered at Gong's restaurant. Gong stood and sincerely thanked everyone for helping him return to Earth safely. But then Dongma, drunk, stood up. In front of everyone, he looked at Gong and asked bluntly, "Do you like Eve?" Dongma had worked hard for 10 years to win Eve's heart, and now because of Gong Ryong, people were starting to talk badly about her. He was angry. Gong Ryong, even though engaged to a rich girl, was now messing with Eve and putting her future at risk. But Gong Ryong didn't hide his feelings. He admitted he loved Eve. In his eyes, Eve cared about every life in space but was even ready to risk hers just to save him. How could he not fall for someone like that? Dongma, furious, punched Gong Ryong. But Gong Ryong didn't fight back. He felt like he deserved it. Then, Gong Ryong told everyone that he liked Eve, but only one-sidedly, and lied that Eve didn't feel the same. After the party, Eve went down to Gong Ryong's house and asked him to come with her to write their mission report. Gong Ryong opened the door and invited her in. Eve hesitated for a second but left. Later, after Gong Ryong showered, he noticed Eve had come back into his place on her own. She was mad. She asked if he really didn't remember the private moments they had in space. Gong Ryong, now frustrated, said he didn't understand why she was being so distant. He kept asking her questions non-stop. Finally, Eve broke down and confessed. From the moment Gong Ryong stitched her toe in space, her feelings started growing. She kept saying she hated him, but Gong Ryong knew that wasn't true. Then suddenly, Eve kissed him. She couldn't hide it anymore. But outside, Goen had been listening the whole time. She had come to Gong Ryong's house and saw Eve inside with him. Later, Goen invited Eve out for a drink. At the bar, Goen ordered drinks and challenged Eve. Whoever drank more would win Gong Ryong. Eve accepted. Glass after glass, Eve kept drinking. After 2 bottles, she apologized to Goen, saying she had tried to fight her feelings, but she couldn't anymore. Goen smiled gently and said Gong Ryong wasn't rich. He was just an OBGYN who needed her family's money. She thought he was just playing with Eve for a while and would eventually come back to her. She wanted to support him and watch him grow. But Eve didn't agree. She even wanted to finish all the alcohol in front of Goen. Right then, Gong Ryong called Eve. Goen was shocked. Even now, Gong Ryong was still contacting her. Late at night, both drunk girls came back home together. Gong Ryong saw them and had no choice but to cover them with a blanket while they passed out. The next day, Eve and Gong Ryong turned in their reports. Since they had planned their stories ahead of time, their reports matched exactly, which made Taehi drop his suspicions. But after Gong Ryong left, Taehi warned Eve to stay away from him. He was worried she'd lose her future as an astronaut. What he didn't know was that the two had already secretly decided to love each other. A few days later, Eve was heading to space again. This time, Dongma also wanted to go, officially to fix the damaged space station, but really to get close to Eve and win her back. Later, Eve, Dongma, and Taehi were checking the spaceship. Eve used the chance to ask Dongma who he liked more, her or Taehi. Taehi also wanted to know. But Dongma hesitated and didn't answer. That night, when Gong Ryong got home, he found Eve at his restaurant. Earlier that day, the mothers of the 3 had gathered and talked about Eve and Gong Ryong's relationship, especially the time they were found hugging naked. They were worried Eve was trying to seduce him. So they called Gong Ryong and invited Eve to dinner, planning to question her. Gong Ryong knew exactly what the moms were trying to do and told them not to meddle. But they didn't stop. They even contacted Eve through Gong Ryong's friend. At the dinner table, the moms tried to get Gong Ryong out of the way. They said he was just an immature guy who got easily excited and might lose control. They warned Eve not to take him seriously. Eve politely smiled and acted like she agreed. But secretly, she kept dating Gong Ryong behind their backs. From the next day, Eve and Gong Ryong officially started dating in secret. They first went to a bathhouse together, then to a bakery, enjoying the fresh warm pastries. But Kangoo wasn't happy. The day before, some astronauts stole Kangoo's lottery ticket to claim the prize. But Kangoo caught them and got it back. The astronauts apologized and explained the whole thing, but also ended up blaming Gong Ryong. Since then, Kangoo was annoyed. He felt Gong Ryong was always taking things from him. The next day, Kangoo got a call from his dad. The Goen Corporation had changed their bank partner. His dad asked him to fix the PO issue. So Kangoo went straight to Goen's father. He demanded the partnership be switched back. He even warned the chairman that Goen was his woman. But the chairman had changed. After Gong Ryong succeeded in bringing the embryo back, he began to respect him more. Kangoo then told the truth, that Gong Ryong had fallen for another woman. Hearing that, the chairman was furious. He called Gong Ryong and shouted at him, asking if he had another woman. If it was true, he said he'd ruin Gong Ryong's career as a doctor forever. Just as Gong Ryong was about to tell the truth, Goen stormed in. She defended him and scolded Kangoo for always bothering her. She told her father that Kangoo never really liked her. He just wanted a business marriage. During their relationship, he only cared about fruit flies and treated her like a lab assistant. Because of Goen's words, the chairman's mood changed again. He asked more kindly about Gong Ryong and then kicked Kangoo out. Kangoo was furious. He even kicked Gong Ryong's car and broke the side mirror. He thought Gong Ryong had stolen both his love and his future. So Kangoo decided to get revenge. He and Gong Ryong ended up in a fight. Then Goen threw something at them to stop their childish fight. Not long after, Kangoo's secret sperm experiments in space were discovered. This broke space laws, so the command center decided to question and monitor him. After the meeting, Dongma again told Eve to stay away from Gong Ryong. But Eve didn't listen. She was heading to space soon and just wanted to enjoy the time she had left with Gong Ryong. Dongma still wanted to know if Eve had ever crossed a line with Gong Ryong. Eve admitted she had. But Dongma refused to believe it. He saw her as a strong leader who always followed the rules. Feeling sad, Dongma walked away. But a water truck suddenly sprayed him. The driver? It was Teehee teasing him on purpose. It started raining hard. Eve had no umbrella, but she ran through the rain anyway. At the crossing, Gong Ryong had been waiting. He held the umbrella over her and walked her across the street. Then he hugged her and whispered sweet words. But unexpectedly, Taehui witnessed the whole scene. From that moment on, she started to suspect something was going on between Gong Ryong and Eve. Later, back at the space agency, Taehui reviewed security footage. She saw a video of Gong Ryong hugging Eve, but what caught her eye was something in the background, a cultivation cage. Curious, she checked the data and realized the power for the cage was active at that exact moment, meaning someone was using it. Combined with the unauthorized sperm experiments led by Kong Su, Taehui quickly pieced it together. Gong Ryong and Kong Su might be working together. She now believed the real reason Gong Ryong insisted on staying in the main cabin was because of that cultivation cage. That night, both Kong Su and Gong Ryong were summoned to the space agency. They denied all accusations. Luckily for them, the surveillance footage wasn't strong enough as proof, so they avoided punishment for now. While leaving the building, Taehui quietly asked Gong Ryong if he really had feelings for Eve. From her point of view, Eve worked hard to become a commander, and Gong Ryong shouldn't do anything reckless to ruin that. Gong Ryong admitted honestly, he was just a regular guy. He couldn't do much for Eve, but at least when she went to space, he wanted to silently support her from Earth, so she wouldn't feel lonely. Meanwhile, Eve made a shocking discovery. The mice they brought back from space? They were pregnant. Thrilled, she quickly contacted Gong Ryong to confirm it. It turned out the mice had mated in space. Life being created in zero gravity, it was a miracle. Gong Ryong rushed to the agency to perform ultrasounds. Both of them were filled with hope. This might bring new possibilities for couples struggling with infertility. The entire agency buzzed with excitement after hearing the news. But not everyone was celebrating. Kong Su was about to get fired. He had earlier been interrogated for doing secret fertilization experiments. The other astronauts, to protect themselves, stayed silent. In the end, Kong Su was stripped of his astronaut title. Before leaving, he angrily mocked the space program that once felt so honorable. Eve, however, silently packed his astronaut uniform and gently placed it in storage. Deep down, she didn't feel right about his dismissal. Later that day, Eve called Gong Ryong. She asked if the embryo he brought back was okay. Gong Ryong didn't want her involved anymore, so he lied. He told her the embryo didn't survive, hoping she'd forget it. But the truth was, he went to meet Minjong to prepare for a uterine examination. He planned to implant the embryo soon. This child would fulfill Minjong's long-held dream and preserve the family line of a powerful chairman. The chairman, meanwhile, made sure the hospital's security was tight. But his daughter Gon had lost interest in Gong Ryong. She said once the embryo was implanted, she'd let him go. The chairman thought she was being stubborn, but Gon just smiled. Letting go of Gong Ryong was inevitable. Elsewhere, the secretary reminded Gon that Kong Su didn't mention Gong Ryong's involvement during his hearing. But Gon didn't care. She felt nothing but disgust toward Kong Su. That night, just after showering, Gon heard someone fumbling with her door. It was Kong Su, totally drunk and barely standing. He wanted to see her but had lost his room key. As she helped him look for it, Gon found a photo of herself inside his wallet. She tried to tear it up, but Kong Su, like a drunk child, kept begging to use the bathroom. With no other choice, she brought him inside. There, Kong Su spilled his true feelings. After losing their child together, he truly wanted to protect the new embryo that Gong Ryong was now involved with. The person bearing the pain of losing that child was also Gong Ryong's mother. Sometime earlier, Eve had visited Gong Ryong's home for dinner. There, the first mother, his mom, heard that Eve was an orphan abandoned on Christmas night by her birth mother. Strangely enough, that was the same night Gong Ryong's mom had secretly abandoned her own baby in a taxi. Trying to confirm a terrible suspicion, the first mother went to the space agency to ask about past records. Eve, though shaken, lied and said she wasn't that abandoned child. The first mother left, heartbroken. But later, Eve took the cup the first mother drank from and ran a DNA test. The result? Eve really was her daughter. She laughed bitterly and destroyed the report. Just then, a colleague told her that one of the pregnant lab mice was dying. Eve rushed to save the mouse, seeing it as a symbol of her own mother, fighting to survive despite everything. Eve didn't blame her mother. She only wanted to live. But she never thought fate would tie her to Gong Ryong like this. That night, Gong Ryong came to see Eve. He handed her a marriage registration form. Since Eve was leaving for space soon, he hoped this would give her a sense of stability and show that she had someone waiting for her. Eve accepted the form but said nothing about the first mother being her real mom. Back home, Eve ate the food the first mother had sent. It was the first time she had ever tasted something made by her mom's hands. The next day, she returned the food container and told the first mother she'd love to eat her food again. The first mother, still unaware of the truth, promised to cook for her again. She thought her kindness reminded Eve of her own mother. Eve didn't correct her. She only asked her to forget the events of that Christmas night long ago. Even though she'd spent years searching, now that she'd finally found her real mom, she couldn't bring herself to reveal the truth. Afterwards, Eve visited the hospital to see Gong Ryong. She only had a few days left before her space mission and wanted to make the most of it. Gong Ryong had a gift for her, a bottle of wine hidden inside a book. Since she'd be gone for a whole year, he hoped the wine would give her strength during her darkest days. While they ate, Eve asked about the embryo again. Gong Ryong avoided the question, but she kept pressing for answers. From his reactions, Eve guessed that 3 astronauts had secretly helped him. She didn't push further. Out of love, she chose to stay quiet. But then bad news hit. 2 days earlier, a repair team was sent to the damaged space cabin. There, they found Gong Ryong's phone. After fixing it, an unsent message was automatically sent to the International Space Agency. In that message, Gong Ryong confessed everything. He had gone to space to perform embryo experiments to preserve the bloodline of a powerful family. Hearing this, Tae Hui panicked. She believed Eve knew all along but chose not to report it. She now suspected that Eve and Gong Ryong were working together to secretly bring the embryo back to Earth. If this was exposed, the entire Korean Space Agency would be held responsible. Gong Ryong's illegal experiment had finally been exposed. The command center decided to confiscate the embryo and punish Gong Ryong. Using his phone's location, they tracked him to the hospital. Tahi acted quickly, deploying personnel to gain control before the news could leak. Meanwhile, the chairman, completely unaware of the danger, had arranged tight security around the hospital. He only wanted the embryo implantation surgery to go smoothly that night. At the same time, Tahi contacted Eve and the 3 other astronauts, ordering them to report to the command center. Eve felt uneasy and immediately tried to call Gong Ryong, but he didn't pick up. At the hospital, the chairman went alone to check on the surgery. That's when the command center staff arrived. They demanded the chairman stop the operation. He refused furiously. Min Jang and Go-eun rushed in to warn Gong Ryong. The operating room couldn't be locked in time. Dongga and his people stormed in and seized the embryo. Gong Ryong tried to lie but failed. Dongga wouldn't buy it. Desperate, Gong risked the embryo's safety to threaten everyone. But it was no use. He was taken away for violating space research ethics. At the command center, Dongga kicked him, demanding the truth. Gong Ryong took all the blame to protect Eve. He insisted Eve knew nothing. He even begged them to return the embryo, calling it a precious life. Eve was also interrogated. She stayed silent, and Tahi guessed why, because of her feelings for Gong Ryong. Tahi reminded her that this scandal could destroy not only her but the entire Korean Space Agency. Korea might be banned from space permanently. Eve tried to defend Gong, saying his crime was about creating life, not death. But Tahi warned her, the United Nations would not see it that way. Gong could lose his license, face criminal charges, and ruin everything. To fix it, Eve asked to meet Gong Ryong alone. Gong worried she might betray him, and she did. As commander, Eve chose to destroy the embryo to protect Gong and the crew. Gong Ryong begged her not to do it, but no one listened. The embryo was destroyed. And so was he. When he confronted her, Eve said nothing. She took all the blame on herself. Meanwhile, Go-eun went to Kong-soo to beg him to help Gong Ryong. But Kong-soo refused. He had already decided to side with the command center to save the corporation. He even worked with Tahi to spin the story, pinning all the blame on Gong Ryong. That night, Gong was forced to present the destroyed embryo to the chairman, who scolded him. Go-eun tried to comfort Gong, but he rejected her kindness, saying he wasn't worth her sacrifice. He left. To silence the media, Tahi ordered Eve back to space to complete a 3-month mission. After that, her title as commander would be revoked. While Eve was in space, Gong Ryong faced trial. He lost his medical license, was sentenced to 2 years of probation, and the company cancelled his engagement to Go-eun. Publicly shamed, Gong became an unethical doctor in the eyes of the world. The chairman felt no regret. He had always known what Gong and Eve did in space. Gong Ryong fell into deep despair. He drank constantly. One night, Kong-soo found him at a night market, smug and victorious. Gong punched him. Even then, Kong-soo offered advice. Go to the US, take the licensing exam again, and reunite with Eve abroad. Gong said nothing and walked away. He ended up working quietly in a restaurant called Three Mothers. One day, Minjang met him. She wanted to go to the US and asked Gong to come with her. But he refused. He had lost faith in himself as a doctor. He was afraid of delivering life again. In space, Eve discovered she was pregnant. She secretly sent an ultrasound to Gong Ryong's friend for analysis. The baby was healthy, about 12 weeks old. But the doctor warned, if Eve returned to Earth, the fetus might not survive atmospheric re-entry. 2 astronauts overheard. They promised to keep the secret. Eve admitted the child's father was Gong Ryong, but she didn't know how to tell him. She thought he hated her and the child. She called Gong Ryong. He didn't answer. He had closed his heart. As her return to Earth neared, Eve did another ultrasound. This time the baby's heartbeat was too fast. On Earth, Gong Ryong's friend finally confronted him, asking whether the child was his. Gong was silent. But when he saw the new ultrasound and heard the baby's heartbeat, something shifted in him. It was his child. And he had to go back to space. Eve reported her pregnancy to the control center. Shocked but supportive, they realized only one person could help, Gong Ryong. Meanwhile, Eve began experiencing abdominal pain. Her condition was worsening. With no time to spare, Gong Ryong boarded a rocket and returned to space. As soon as he arrived, he performed surgery on Eve, saving her and their unborn child. Eve cried with joy when she saw him. Together, they started a peaceful life on the space station. Eve named the baby Bail, meaning star. She wanted Bail to be born in space, to see the universe with new eyes. A few days later, Eve asked Gong to return to Earth. He was untrained this time, staying too long was dangerous. But Gong refused. He wanted Eve to return, even if it meant sacrificing the baby. Eve begged him to go alone. Gong said if she didn't go, he wouldn't either. To protect him, Eve agreed to leave. But during re-entry, her anxiety spiked. Her blood pressure and heart rate became unstable. Ground control had no choice. Abort re-entry, return to the space station. 1 week before the due date, Gong led the astronauts in preparations. Finally, Eve gave birth. Gong Ryong himself delivered the baby. With the baby's cries, Bail was born safely. They held hands full of joy, now they were a family. But tragedy followed. Eve had fractured her pelvis. The pressure damaged her blood vessels, a warning ground control had feared. The situation was fatal. Gong Ryong didn't know. He stayed lovingly by her side. A year later, back on Earth, Kong-soo opened the first space fertility clinic, using microgravity to help infertile couples. At the press conference, he even confessed to Go-eun. He wanted a future with her in space. By then, Bail turned 1. Gong Ryong never left the station. He stayed with Bail, determined to find a way to bring him home, even if it meant facing punishment again. Eve had already passed away. Her body, like her spirit, was given to the stars. Years passed. Bail grew up, healthy and bright. Eventually, he brought his children to visit his aging father. Gong Ryong's life neared its end, but the universe lived on. The cycle of life, love, and sacrifice never stopped. Spaceborne ends here. Thank you for watching.